Most High created you and I, created in the likeness of created. We are created, and we must create creations that the Most High God can see. Creating new visions, being extension, shedding new wisdom to the elders. Often said but seldomly embraced. Out of the mouths of babes come wisdom, and wise ones need sun and earth and love and food, feeding children. Who's feeding them? Who's feeding them knowledge and freedom? Feeding them. Who's feeding them that we are part of the whole? Feeding them. Who's feeding them purpose? Feeding them. Who's feeding them that revolution revolves around itself and evolution and change? Feeding them. Who's feeding them? Be yourself. Feeding them. Who's feeding them diversity? Feeding them. Who's feeding them faith? Feeding them. Who's feeding them spirituality? Feeding them. Who's feeding them differences and preferences? Feeding them. Who's feeding them culture? Feeding them. Who's nurturing what they begin to feed themselves? Freedom. Feeding them. Seeding them at the root of their own. Feeding them that home is where the heart is, and the heart is governed by emotions, and emotions are not always logical or practical. Feeding them. Who's feeding them? Feeding them and allowing them to prove themselves. Who's feeding them fundamental knowledge? Feeding them. Who's feeding them creative? We must create. Feeding them love. Who's feeding them love? Feeding them. Who's feeding them freedom? Feeding them. Who's feeding them? Who's feeding them love? Feeding them. Who's feeding them freedom? Feeding them. Who's feeding them? Who's feeding them freedom to love? Feeding them. Who's feeding them love? Feeding them. Who's feeding them freedom? Feeding them. Who's feeding them love? Feeding them. Walking through the muck and clay of this journey, I scratch my head in wonderment. Truly amazed at what the Most High God has done. Created. The Most High God created. The Most High created you and I, and we created in the likeness all created. And we must create the Most High God can see. Creating visions, being extensions, shedding new wisdom to the elders. Often said but seldomly embraced. Out of the mouths of babes come wisdom, and wise ones see sun and earth and love and food, but who's feeding the children? Who's feeding them? Who's feeding them differences and preferences? Feeding them. Who's feeding them differences and preferences? Feeding them. Who's feeding them culture? 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 Feeding them. Who's nurturing what they begin to feed themselves? Freedom. Feeding them at the root of their own. Who's feeding them knowledge and freedom? Feeding them. Who's feeding them that we are part of the whole? Feeding them. Who's feeding them purpose? Feeding them. Who's feeding them the revolution revolves around itself and evolution and change? Feeding them. Who's feeding them be yourself? Feeding them. Who's feeding them diversity? Feeding them. Who's feeding them diversity? Feeding them. Who's feeding them diversity? Feeding them. Who's feeding them faith? Feeding them. Who's feeding them spirituality? Feeding them.
Mm-hmm.